You crazy city fool. You saved my life. You proved your spirit is grander than any mountain in this territory.
When a brilliant but fragile city engineer is ambushed by ruthless corporate mercenaries in the high country, it takes a fierce, gun-slinging female cowboy to blast him out of his grave. But as their worlds collide at Ironwood, they realize his mind is the only weapon powerful enough to break the legal trap tightening around her throat. Hit that like button and subscribe to join the Ironwood anthology. Drop a comment with your country below. The jagged grey limestone cliffs of the northern ridge cut through the freezing mountain mist like broken teeth, casting a bleak and ominous shadow over the isolated valley trail. A violent mountain wind howled through the pines, kicking up flurries of icy grit that stung the eyes and obscured the path ahead. In the centre of a narrow clearing, the fragile peace of the wilderness was brutally shattered by the raw, chaotic noise of violence. Arthur Pendleton lay face down in the freezing slush, his custom-tailored Boston wool suit torn to shreds, his round, wire-rimmed spectacles knocked sideways across his pale, bruised cheekbone. He gasped for air, his thin chest heaving in shallow, frantic bursts as a violent fit of coughing racked his fragile frame. Standing over him were 3 rough-necked mercenaries hired by the Apex Mining Corporation, their grease-stained leather vests and heavy boots caked in mountain mud. One of them, a scarred brute carrying a heavy iron-headed whip, kicked Arthur brutally in the ribs, sending the young engineer sprawling backward against a decaying log. "Get up, you fancy city rat," the brute sneered, his raspy voice laced with a cruel, unhinged malice as he reached down to snatch Arthur's leather satchel, which contained confidential geological charts and federal survey blueprints. "Your rich family in Boston can't save you out here in the dirt. These maps belong to Apex now, and your body belongs to the Timberwolves." Arthur clutched his aching side, his fingers trembling violently from both the freezing cold and pure, unadulterated terror. He was a creature of universities, grand libraries, and precise mathematical calculations. He possessed zero physical strength to combat the primitive brutality of the frontier. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the final lethal blow. The sudden, thunderous blast of a heavy 12-gauge shotgun echoed through the canyon walls, its violent percussion causing the mercenaries' horses to rear back in frantic panic. Before the outlaws could even draw their revolvers, a massive buckskin stallion tore through the thick pine brush, driven forward by a rider who moved with an absolute terrifying kinetic torque. It was Maeve. Her weathered leather duster flared behind her like the wings of a predatory hawk, her chiseled, sun-darkened features locked in a mask of cold, focused fury. Her thick, capable forearms were completely bare despite the freezing wind, her large hands gripping a smoking, double-barreled shotgun with an ironclad certainty that left zero room for ambiguity. With a smooth, effortless display of horsemanship, Maeve guided her stallion directly between the mercenaries and the bruised city engineer, her shadow completely caging Arthur's fragile form from further harm. "The next piece of lead doesn't go into the air, boys," Maeve declared, her voice a low, gravelly baritone that cut through the howling wind with the weight of an executioner's verdict. She did not plea and she did not hesitate. She simply levelled the roaring twin barrels directly at the leader's chest, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce, unyielding pride. "You have exactly 5 seconds to drop that leather satchel and clear out of this valley before I turn your hides into targets for the Ironwood line riders. Step away from the gentleman." The mercenaries froze, their hands hovering nervously over their holsters as they tracked the raw, explosive power radiating from the female cowboy. They knew the reputation of Maeve, the most fearless horse-tamer in the territory, a woman who broke wild stallions for breakfast and spoke the language of black powder better than anyone alive. Realizing they were completely outmatched by her lethal positioning, the brute threw the leather satchel into the slush, cursed loudly under his breath, and spurred his horse into a frantic retreat down the rocky path. Maeve kept her weapon trained on their shadows until the sound of their hooves faded completely into the mist. Only then did she lower the iron barrels, swinging her leg over the saddle and landing on the frozen earth with a heavy, grounding thud that made the gravel crunch beneath her boots. She strode toward the trembling aristocrat, her large, calloused hand reaching down to grab his collar with an immense protective strength, dragging him back into the land of the living. The immense log walls of the Ironwood outpost kitchen hummed with the deep, reassuring vibration of a massive birch fire roaring inside the hearth. Heavy iron kettles hissed softly over the embers, casting long, shifting amber shadows across rows of polished copper pans and thick timber rafters. Maeve practically threw Arthur into a heavy, high-backed oak chair near the flame, her bare, muscular forearms glistening with a sheen of melted snow and sweat. She didn't offer a gentle greeting or an aristocratic cushion. She simply shoved a tin mug of scalding chicory coffee into his trembling hands and began pacing the floorboards like a restless panther, her heavy spurs jingling in a rhythmic, aggressive cadence against the pine planks. Arthur sat frozen, his thin chest heaving beneath his ruined Boston wool suit as the suffocating chill of the high canyon slowly began to drain from his bones. He reached up with trembling fingers, adjusting his round wire-rimmed spectacles over his bruised cheekbone, his wide eyes tracking the female cowboy with a mixture of sheer awe and absolute intellectual bewilderment. He was an urban aristocrat, a man whose entire existence was defined by the silent sanctuary of university libraries and precise mathematical instruments. He had never seen a human being radiate such raw, kinetic torque, let alone a woman who commanded a 12-gauge shotgun with the clinical precision of a veteran soldier. "Drink the chicory before your fingers freeze off, city boy," Maeve rasped, her low, gravelly baritone vibrating with a fierce impatience as she tossed her wet leather duster onto a corner peg. She stopped her pacing, leaning her broad shoulders against the massive stone mantelpiece, her dark eyes drilling into him with an unyielding intensity. "You look like a stiff breeze could crack your ribs in half. What in the world possesses a fragile gentleman from the east to march into the high granite ridges with nothing but a leather satchel and a pair of shiny boots? If I hadn't been out there tracking a stray stallion, those apex mercenaries would have buried you beneath the slush by noon." Arthur took a hesitant, burning gulp of the coffee, his throat constriction clearing as the intense heat hit his chest. He cleared his throat, his refined, articulate voice carrying a distinct Massachusetts elegance despite his exhaustion. "My name is Arthur Pendleton, ma'am. I am a senior trawl surveyor and legal archivist commissioned by the Territorial Railway Commission. Those men, they weren't just common highwaymen. They were searching for my satchel. It contains the original geological blueprints and federal land grants for this entire valley." He scrambled to open the weathered leather bag resting on his lap, his long, slender fingers moving with a sudden frantic urgency as he pulled out a series of rolled parchment maps. "They are trying to alter the legal boundaries of this basin, and if I am not mistaken, your ranch is the primary target." Maeve's entire body went rigid, the dismissive arrogance on her chiseled features instantly evaporating into a cold, dangerous stillness. She strode forward, her heavy boots making a hollow, thunderous thud against the timber as she reached down and snatched one of the maps from his hands. Her dark eyes swept across the intricate lines and mathematical annotations, her jaw locking with a terrifying intensity as she recognized the predatory design of the Apex Mining Corporation. On the kitchen table beside the maps lay a stack of official, red-sealed eviction notices that Maeve had hidden away, notices that claimed her fertile Thung Lung pastures were actually public mining territory, threatening to strip away the land she had bled to defend. She had been preparing to solve the problem with black powder and lead, but Arthur's blueprints revealed a far more complex, legal cage tightening around her throat. A profound, tense silence filled the room as the fragile genius and the fierce female cowboy stared at the maps, realizing that the corporate monsters had forged an invisible trap that could not be broken by a shotgun alone. The flickering amber glow of the fireplace illuminated the intricate network of lines on the parchment map, casting long, skeletal shadows across the kitchen table. Arthur's slender, ink-stained fingers traced a jagged boundary line drawn in thick black ink, his spectacles sliding slightly down his nose as his eyes darted across the mathematical survey notes. The fragile engineer had completely transformed. The paralyzing terror that had gripped him in the slush had vanished, replaced by the sharp, clinical focus of absolute genius navigating his true domain. Maeve stood directly over him, her monumental presence looming like a thundercloud, her large hand resting heavily on the iron butt of her holstered revolver. "Look right here," Arthur murmured, his refined voice steadying as his intellect took the reins. He tapped a fingernail against a red-stamped seal at the corner of the document. "This isn't a standard territorial boundary claim. The Apex Mining Corporation hasn't just filed a dispute. They've executed a highly sophisticated archival forgery. They are using an obsolete federal statute from 1862, the Homestead Nullification Act, to argue that your low-lying valley pastures sit on top of a vital mineral vein belonging to the state." Maeve let out a low, dangerous growl, her jaw locking so tightly the scarred skin across her cheekbones turned white. "That basin has belonged to my family since the first timber rails were laid, city boy. My father bled into that dirt. And I've buried 3 line riders in the northern ridges defending it from cattle thieves. I don't care what kind of fancy ink or obsolete papers those corporate bastards bring to my gate. If they try to set up a mining rig on my grass, I'll open up their chests with lead." "And that is exactly what they want you to do," Arthur countered sharply, swinging his head up to lock his wide, intense gaze with her fierce stare. He did not flinch from her explosive fury this time. Instead, his mind moved with a rapid defensive calculation. If you fire a single shot at their legal agents, you play directly into their script. The moment you pull that trigger, Apex will use the territorial governor to brand you an outlaw. They will declare this entire ranch a quarantine zone of violence, revoke your land titles vitukak fapli, and send a platoon of federal cavalry to confiscate every acre. Your shotgun cannot butcher a signed judicial decree, Maeve. The female cowboy slammed her fist onto the pine table with a thunderous force that made the tin coffee mugs rattle, her dark eyes flashing with a raw, fierce helplessness. For a woman who had spent her entire life solving problems through physical dominance and black powder, the realization that her weapons were utterly useless against a scrap of paper was a suffocating torment. She spun away, marching toward the window to stare out into the blinding mountain blizzard, her broad shoulders tense under the strain of an invisible cage. Arthur watched her, his heart aching with a profound, sudden protectiveness for the fierce warrior who had blasted him out of his grave, realizing that his fragile, academic mind was the only shield left to save her kingdom. The heavy oak door of the outpost kitchen swung open with a slow, deliberate weight, allowing a brief swirl of freezing mountain air and crystalline snow to dance across the floorboards before it was firmly shut. Evelina Vance stepped into the amber warmth of the room, her monumental frame draped in a long, snow-dusted mantle of midnight blue wool. She did not possess the frantic anxiety of the townspeople or the explosive fury of Maeve. Her presence radiated an absolute, unshakable sanctuary that instantly anchored the volatile energy in the kitchen. Her dark eyes swept over the scattering of rolled parchment maps on the pine table, then rested on Arthur, tracking his bruised spectacles and slender fingers with a razor-sharp intellectual calculation. Maeve did not turn around from the window, her large hands still clenched into tight fists against the timber frame. "They're trying to steal the basin, Evelina, not with cattle prods or dynamite, but with red seals and obsolete federal statutes. This city boy says my shotgun can't stop them." Evelina moved closer to the hearth, her heavy boots making a solid rhythmic cadence against the pine planks. She poured a fresh cup of chicory coffee, her magnificent volume completely filling the space as she approached Arthur. She extended her large, capable hand, her thick fingers gently setting the warm mug before the trembling engineer. The heavy silver signet ring of the mountain anvil gleamed proudly under the firelight, a permanent symbol of her undisputed sovereign rule over the territory. "He is right, Maeve," Evelina murmured, her rich, resonant baritone filling the quiet room with a calming density that acted like a soothing balm over Maeve's fierce panic. "A corporate syndicate doesn't fight in the dirt until they have already choked you on paper, but paper can be torn by a mind that understands its architecture." She turned her gaze directly onto Arthur, her dark eyes drilling into his soul with an immense protective warmth. She leaned her broad shoulders against the edge of the table, looking down at the fragile genius who had been cast out of Boston into the lawless wilderness. "You look shaken, Mr. Pendleton," Evelina stated, her voice carrying an ironclad certainty. "But I see the geometry in your eyes. You didn't come to this high country just to draw lines for the railway. You came because you know how to read the bedrock. Maeve is a creature of the wind and the wild. She knows how to tame a stallion, but she doesn't know how to navigate a court decree. If you want to protect her, do not try to match her force with muscle. Show her that your mind can build a sky big enough for her to fly safely. Tell us what the maps are truly hiding." Arthur took a slow, grounding breath, the profound composition of the Empress of Ironwood giving him a sudden, immense burst of academic courage. He stood up, his thin chest squaring as he pulled a secondary, older blueprint from his leather satchel, his articulate voice ringing out with absolute authority. "The apex forgery relies on a missing variable," Arthur declared, his wide eyes flashing with intellectual fire. "The 1862 statute requires a physical original stone marker, the sovereign anvil meridian, to be verified on the actual terrain. Apex has drawn a fraudulent marker on their copy, but the true, historical stone marker is buried deep within the northern granite shelves. If we can find that original stone and match its unique geological serial stamps to the Federal Archive registry in my satchel, their eviction decree becomes an absolute criminal fraud. But the shelves are guarded by their mercenaries, and a blizzard is closing the passes." Maeve spun around from the window, her dark eyes locking onto Arthur with a sudden, overwhelming emotion that completely replaced her helplessness. The fierce female cowboy looked at the fragile, bruised gentleman and saw for the very first time a warrior whose weapons were grander than any 12-gauge shotgun. A silent, consuming devotion began to ignite between the two opposites, sealing a dangerous covenant to march directly into the freezing heart of the mountains together. The freezing wind howled like a pack of starving wolves as the heavy oak doors of the Ironwood stables swung shut, completely sealing Arthur and Maeve into a world of blinding horizontal snow. The afternoon light had vanished, swallowed by a massive, slate-grey blizzard that roared down from the northern peaks, turning the steep mountain trail into a treacherous wall of white slush and hidden ice. Maeve rode at the front upon her massive buckskin stallion, her muscular frame leaning heavily forward against the gale, her large hands expertly maneuvering the thick leather reins with total, effortless control. Her eyes were narrowed into thin slits against the biting frost, her mind completely focused on the dangerous terrain ahead. Behind her, fighting for every single breath, was Arthur. The fragile city engineer sat slumped atop a sturdy mountain mare that Maeve had carefully prepared for him, his thin fingers frozen stiff inside his leather gloves as he desperately clutched the saddle pommel. The physical toll of the frontier was punishing him relentlessly. The thin mountain air burned his lungs like liquid fire, and a continuous, exhausting cough tore at his fragile frame with every stride of the horse. His round, wire-rimmed spectacles were completely frosted over, leaving him virtually blind in the swirling white void, yet he refused to cry out or ask to turn back. He held his leather satchel containing the critical federal documents tightly against his chest, protecting the blueprints with his very life. Suddenly, Arthur's mare struck a hidden sheet of black ice near a steep granite drop-off. The horse panicked, its hooves slipping violently in the slush as it reared back with a frantic shriek. Arthur lost his grip entirely, his slender body slipping from the saddle and plunging heavily into a deep, freezing snowbank at the very edge of the abyss. He gasped, the violent impact knocking the remaining air from his lungs, rendering him completely paralyzed under the suffocating weight of the drift. Before the blizzard could swallow his pale form, a massive dark silhouette descended upon the drift like an avenging angel. Maeve had vaulted from her stallion before it had even come to a halt, her heavy leather boots crunching deeply into the ice as she threw her full physical weight into the snow. With an immense protective surge of strength, she shoved her bare forearms deep into the freezing slush, grabbed Arthur beneath his shoulders, and dragged his fragile frame completely out of the white grave, lifting him effortlessly up against her broad, warm chest. She wiped the frost from his bruised face, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, overwhelming emotion as she looked down at the shivering gentleman. She had expected the city aristocrat to weep, to beg for mercy, or to surrender to the brutal reality of the wilderness. Instead, as Arthur weakly adjusted his broken spectacles with trembling fingers, his pale lips parted into a determined, defiant smile, his wide eyes locked onto hers with an unbroken, intellectual fire that refused to be quenched by the storm. Maeve felt a profound shock resonate through her entire being. The fierce female cowboy realized that behind this man's fragile, breaking exterior lay a spirit of absolute steel, a resilience so grand and unyielding that it completely earned her deepest admiration. Without a single word, she hoisted him up onto her own stallion, climbing into the saddle directly behind him to wrap her massive warm duster around his shivering frame, pulling him tight against her heartbeat as they charged deeper into the blinding fury of the northern ridges. The howling blizzard began to fracture as the trail climbed higher, revealing the massive, terrifying architecture of the northern granite shelves. Giant pillars of dark stone thrust upward into the slate-grey sky like the ribs of an ancient cathedral, their sheer faces caked in thick sheets of blue glacial ice. The air here was thin, freezing and deadly still, every echo amplified against the massive rock monoliths. Maeve kept her stallion in a tight, cautious trot, her hand resting heavily on the cold iron grip of her Winchester rifle as she navigated the narrow mountain pass. Arthur sat directly in front of her, his fragile frame insulated by the immense protective warmth of her leather duster, his spectacles cleared enough to track the geometric coordinates on his compass. Suddenly, the sharp, echoing crack of a high-powered rifle shattered the icy silence, the bullet biting violently into the granite wall mere inches above Maeve's hat, showering them in sharp stone shards. "Ambush," Maeve rasped, her low baritone slicing through the panic as she violently pulled the stallion's reins to the left. Down the rocky ridge, 4 Apex mining mercenaries clad in heavy grease-stained canvas coats were scrambling into firing positions, their repeating rifles leveled directly at the Ironwood riders. The corporate syndicate had anticipated Arthur's move, placing a permanent patrol along the shelves to ensure the original stone marker remained buried forever beneath the ice. Maeve didn't hesitate. Before a second volley could erupt, she vaulted off the buckskin stallion, her heavy boots striking the frozen earth with a thunderous thud. With a swift mechanical torque, she grabbed Arthur by his collar, dragging his fragile frame off the horse and shoving him violently beneath the protective overhang of a massive granite boulder. A split second later, a hail of lead tore through the space they had just occupied, the hot bullets whining as they ricocheted off the stone. "Stay down, Arthur. Do not move from this crevice," Maeve commanded, her voice an ironclad certainty that left zero room for argument. She spun around, her chiseled features hardened into a mask of pure predatory fury as she raised her Winchester. Moving with an absolute, terrifying kinetic grace, she stepped out from behind the boulder, her bare forearms flexing as she pumped the lever-action rifle, sending 3 rapid shots screaming down the canyon. The lead hit the lead mercenary squarely in his shoulder, forcing the patrol to scatter into the rocks for cover, but they had the absolute advantage of numbers and height. Trapped against the sheer cliff face, Maeve and Arthur were completely caged in a lethal game of cat and mouse, the air thick with the acrid scent of black powder as hostile fire continued to pulverize the granite sanctuary shielding the fragile engineer. The absolute heavy darkness of the hidden cavern felt like a physical weight, completely isolating them from the violent chaos of the canyon outside. Deep within the ice-locked granite ridges, the air was deadly still, thick with the scent of ancient stone, damp moss, and the faint, acrid sulphur of black powder smoke lingering on Maeve's leather duster. The distant, muffled cracks of the mercenaries' repeating rifles echoed faintly against the mountain exterior, but inside this stone sanctuary a profound, suffocating silence settled over the 2 fugitives. Maeve had dragged Arthur through a narrow, frozen crevice just as the patrol's gunfire had pulverized their previous cover, effectively caging them in the freezing belly of the mountain. Maeve sat flat against the cavern floor, her massive frame resting against a jagged limestone pillar. Even in the pitch black, she exuded a dominant protective warmth. She reached out, her large calloused hands finding Arthur's shivering shoulders in the dark and pulling his fragile frame directly against her broad chest, wrapping the heavy folds of her wool-lined duster entirely around his trembling body. Arthur did not resist. He leaned heavily into her immense physical presence, his thin chest heaving in shallow, exhausting gasps as he struggled to regain his breath. His spectacles were tucked safely into his vest pocket, and without them his wide eyes were soft, vulnerable, and completely exposed to the darkness. "You're shaking like a newborn calf, city boy," Maeve whispered, her low gravelly baritone stripped of its usual aggressive armor, dropping into a deep, velvety cadence that vibrated directly through Arthur's back. She tightened her grip, her powerful forearms acting as an unbreakable shield against the freezing drafts. "I've never seen a man look so fragile yet refuse to lay down and die. Most gentlemen from the East would have been weeping for their mothers by now." Arthur let out a weak, raspy laugh that quickly dissolved into a brief cough. He leaned his head back against her shoulder, drawing deep comfort from her solid, unyielding embrace. "My father, he would have preferred it if I had wept, Maeve. In Boston, my family views physical vulnerability as a cardinal sin. My brothers are all massive, brutal tycoons who command shipping fleets and iron foundries. I was the disappointment, the weak, academic child who preferred geometry and legal archives to physical dominance. They explicitly pulling strings to send me to this lawless frontier because they believed the harsh wilderness would break me completely. They wanted to prove that my mind was a useless, pathetic thing." Maeve went completely still, her dark eyes staring into the blindness of the cave as a sharp, painful sting of recognition pierced her heart. "They're fools," Maeve muttered fiercely, her grip tightening with an intense, sudden surge of protective fury. "They don't understand the architecture of real strength. My whole life, this valley has told me I'm too rough, too wild, too thuggish for a woman. When my father was murdered by cattle thieves, the townspeople expected me to sell out and crawl back to a city parlor. I had to turn my heart into a fortress of iron and lead just to keep the wolves from eating my family's legacy. The world only values us when we fit their stupid boxes, Arthur." She reached up, her thick, calloused fingers gently tracing the bruised line of his jaw, her touch surprisingly tender despite her raw power. In the quiet warmth of their shared isolation, the immense contrast between the fierce female cowboy and the fragile gentleman dissolved into a profound, consuming devotion. Arthur turned his head minutely, his lips brushing against the warm skin of her bare forearm, a silent, reverent gesture of absolute trust. They were two outcasts who had found their perfect, unbending solidarity in the dark, entirely bound by a dangerous affection that would soon drive them to shatter the corporate forces hunting their lives. The roaring fury of the blizzard finally broke near midnight, leaving the high mountain world trapped in a vast, breathless silence that felt almost sacred. The heavy clouds parted like a torn curtain, revealing a brilliant, piercing canopy of silver winter stars that cast a diamond-like glitter across the ice-covered granite shelves. Outside the hidden cavern, the air was sharp and deadly cold, a pristine vacuum where every breath formed a thick cloud of white vapor. Arthur stepped out onto the frozen stone ledge, his thin frame shivering violently despite the heavy wool blankets Maeve had wrapped around him, but his long, slender fingers were remarkably steady as he unpacked his brass surveying instruments. He set up his vintage brass theodolite on a level patch of ice, his round, wire-rimmed spectacles reflecting the cold starlight as his eyes darted from the celestial constellations down to the precise mathematical logarithmic tables in his notebook. He was completely in his element now. His fragile body was battered and bruised, but his academic mind was operating with the rapid, flawless calculation of a master architect. Maeve stood directly behind him, her monumental presence serving as a human shield against the freezing mountain drafts. Her Winchester rifle held loosely across her chest as her dark eyes scanned the dark crags for any sign of the Apex mercenaries. "The corporate blueprints are a mathematical lie, Maeve," Arthur murmured. his articulate voice carrying a deep, thrilling clarity that cut through the silent night air. He turned a small brass dial on his instrument, aligning the crosshairs perfectly with the North Star and a distant granite peak. Apex calculated their fraudulent coordinates using a flat grid system, intentionally ignoring the natural curvature of the mountain range. They wanted the false marker to appear miles away on your grazing lands. But if we apply the true spherical triangulation method, used by the original Federal Survey of 1862, the real sovereign anvil meridian can only exist in one precise location. He closed his notebook with a sharp, definitive snap, his wide eyes flashing with a triumphant intellectual fire that completely captivated the female cowboy. He pointed his slender finger toward a narrow, treacherous depression buried beneath a massive drift of snow at the absolute base of the highest granite monolith. "It's right there," Arthur declared, his voice ringing out with an absolute ironclad certainty, buried under 3 feet of glacial ice, less than 50 yards from where we stand. The history books don't lie, even if corporate lawyers do. Maeve felt a profound surge of emotion tighten her throat as she looked from the fragile genius to the hidden dip in the stone shelves. She had spent weeks fighting an invisible monster with her sung, completely blind to the legal trap that was choking her empire. Yet this slender city gentleman, armed with nothing but a brass scope and a pencil, had systematically shattered the enemy's illusion in the middle of a frozen wasteland. With an intense, consuming devotion, she reached down and gripped his hand, her large, calloused fingers squeezing his with an immense protective warmth. "Then let's go dig up your truth, Arthur," she whispered fiercely, her low baritone vibrating with an unbending solidarity as she grabbed her iron shovel and led him down into the shadows of the trenches. The iron edge of Maeve's shovel struck the deeply frozen earth with a sharp metallic clang that vibrated through the icy floor of the trench. For over an hour she had worked with a relentless rhythmic intensity, her muscular forearms flexing beneath her rolled sleeves as she threw mounds of packed snow and glittering glacial ice over her shoulder. Arthur knelt right beside her inside the narrow pit, refusing to remain a passive spectator. Despite the brutal cold that made his breath come in ragged, painful gasps, he used his small silver grading trowel to carefully clear the delicate layer of frozen dirt away from the rock face, his wire-rimmed spectacles sliding down his nose from the sheer physical exertion. "Hold on," Arthur whispered, his articulate voice catching in his throat as his trowel scraped against a perfectly flat, unnatural edge buried deep within the permafrost. "Maeve, stop digging. This is it." Maeve dropped the shovel, instantly dropping to her knees beside him in the narrow trench. Together their hands moved with a frantic, desperate precision to sweep away the remaining debris. Under the pale, brilliant light of the winter stars, the ancient stone marker of the sovereign anvil meridian finally emerged from its 30-year grave. It was a massive block of dark, polished granite, its surface deeply carved with the official federal insignia of 1862 and a unique 6-digit geological serial stamp. This was the absolute unchangeable truth that would tear the Apex Mining Corporation's eviction decree into worthless shreds. "We found it," Maeve breathed, her low, gravelly baritone cracking with a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief. She looked at Arthur, her dark eyes overflowing with an intense, consuming devotion for the fragile genius who had led her directly to her salvation. "You actually did it, city boy." "I need to document the serial stamps immediately," Arthur said, his fingers trembling with excitement as he pulled his official registry logbook and a lead pencil from his leather satchel. He leaned over the stone, focusing his wide eyes on the faded engravings. The profound silence of the mountain midnight was brutally shattered by the deafening roar of a repeating rifle. A hot lead slug bit violently into the granite wall of the trench, missing Arthur's head by mere inches and showering his trembling frame in sharp, stinging stone fragments. Down the ridge, the blinding white glare of several oil lanterns cut through the darkness as a ruthless squad of 6 Apex mining mercenaries materialized from the shadow of the crags, their weapons leveled directly at the pit. The corporate syndicate had used the brief clearance of the storm to track the stallion's deep hoofprints through the fresh drifts, catching the 2 fugitives completely exposed. "Kill the engineer and burn the satchel," the mercenary captain roared, his voice echoing brutally off the monoliths as a continuous volley of hostile gunfire erupted through the night. The trench had instantly transformed from a historical sanctuary into a deadly execution box, the air thick with the acrid stench of black powder as Maeve violently lunged across the pit to shield Arthur's fragile body with her own monumental frame. The narrow trench became a blinding vortex of noise, sparks, and choking white smoke as the mercenaries' relentless barrage pulverized the upper lip of the granite pit. Shards of ancient stone rained down like shrapnel, slicing through the freezing air. Maeve was a monument of pure kinetic defense. Dropping to one knee, her formidable frame completely shielded the narrow opening where Arthur was cornered, her bare forearms tightening as she brought her Winchester rifle to her shoulder. With a smooth mechanical speed born of a lifetime on the wild frontier, she pumped the lever-action mechanism, sending a steady stream of heavy lead back into the flashing lantern light of the advancing squad. "Keep your head down, Arthur," Maeve roared, her low, gravelly baritone cutting through the deafening cracks of the rifles. She fired twice more, her shots pinpointing the mercenary muzzle flashers and forcing two of the gunmen to dive behind a frozen log for cover. "I can pin them down for a few minutes, but we are running out of lead. If they flank us on the right crag, this pit becomes our coffin." Arthur lay flat in the freezing slush, the violent concussions of the gunfire vibrating directly through his thin chest. Every instinct in his fragile body screamed at him to curl into a ball and surrender to the absolute terror of the ambush. But as he looked up through his cracked spectacles and saw the immense, unyielding wall of Maeve's back, saw the fierce devotion with which she was risking her life to protect his, something inside the city gentleman snapped. The paralysis of his physical weakness dissolved, replaced by a sudden burning surge of absolute bravery. He realized that his mind, and the truth carved into the stone beneath him, was the only weapon that could truly save her empire. Ignoring the hot lead whizzing mere inches above his shoulders, Arthur began to crawl through the frozen mud toward the exposed face of the sovereign anvil meridian. His hands shook violently from the biting cold, but his focus was razor-sharp. He pulled a heavy sheet of charcoal tracing paper and a thick graphite block from his leather satchel. Pressing the parchment flat against the freezing granite marker, he began to furiously rub the graphite across the raised federal insignia and the critical 6-digit geological serial stamps. The friction of his frantic movements was the only sound he could control as the battlefield erupted around him. A bullet ripped through the strap of his satchel, tearing it from his shoulder, but Arthur didn't flinch. He kept his slender fingers pressed into the stone, finalizing the perfect, undeniable carbon rubbing of the legal boundary marker. He rolled the document tightly, shoving it deep inside the waterproof pocket of his coat, just as Maeve's Winchester clicked hollowly on an empty chamber. They were out of ammunition, but the definitive legal leverage required to dismantle the corporate syndicate was officially sealed in his hands. The hollow mechanical click of Maeve's empty rifle chamber signaled an immediate terrifying shift in the canyon balance. Down the rocky slope, the corporate mercenaries heard the sound, their distorted faces twisting into ruthless sneers as they realized the fierce female cowboy was entirely out of ammunition. With a coordinated roar, the remaining 4 gunmen surged forward from their stone cover, their heavy leather boots crunching violently through the slush as they closed the distance to the narrow trench. They raised their weapons, preparing to execute the 2 fugitives at point-blank range. But the final, lethal strike did not come from a rifle barrel. A stray high-velocity bullet from the previous volley had zipped high into the darkness, embedding itself deeply into a highly unstable, fragile ice shelf hanging directly over the granite pit. A succession of sharp snapping sounds like breaking glass echoed through the midnight air as massive fissures rapidly spiderwebbed across the ancient stone ledge. Suddenly, with a deafening, thunderous roar, the entire overhang fractured, triggering a massive, cascading rockfall of frozen earth and jagged granite boulders that plunged directly toward the trench. Maeve was caught completely off balance, her hands still frantically searching her leather belt for a spare cartridge. She looked up into the darkness, her wide eyes reflecting the oncoming avalanche of crushing stone, her monumental frame temporarily paralyzed by the sheer speed of the disaster. Before the tumbling boulders could pulverize her body, a sudden, explosive force lunged across the narrow pit. Arthur did not hesitate, and he did not calculate the physical odds of his survival. Driven by an intense, consuming devotion that transcended his physical limitations, the fragile city gentleman threw his entire slender body directly over Maeve's magnificent chest, using his own physical frame as a human shield to cage her from the falling debris. A split second later, a jagged, 20-pound block of granite struck Arthur squarely across his upper back and shoulder with a sickening, heavy thud. He let out a sharp, agonizing cry, his vision flashing a blinding white as the sheer mechanical impact fractured his collarbone and sent a wave of paralyzing pain radiating through his thin chest. He collapsed heavily against Maeve's bosom, his breath completely stolen by the injury, yet his long, slender fingers remained locked around the waterproof pocket containing the documented stone rubbings, protecting the legal truth until the very end. The rockfall settled as quickly as it had begun, leaving the trench buried in a thick shroud of grey stone dust and shattered ice. Maeve lay perfectly untouched beneath him, her heart hammering violently against her ribs as she stared up at the pale, sweating face of the gentleman who had just risked his life to save hers. A profound, overwhelming shock transformed into an unbreakable, sacred bond within her soul. The fierce warrior of the frontier realized that this fragile aristocrat had performed the ultimate act of physical sacrifice for her sake. Her dark eyes burned with a new terrifying level of protective fury as she gently cradled his injured form, preparing to unleash an unyielding retribution upon the corporate monsters who had dared to break the man she loved. The white stone dust from the collapsed ice shelf slowly drifted through the trench like a phantom shroud, settling over Arthur's pale, sweat-sheened forehead. He lay perfectly still against Maeve's chest, his breathing shallow and rattling, his lips clamped tight to suppress the agonizing waves of pain radiating from his broken collarbone. Seeing the fragile scholar who had never wielded a weapon throw his own body into the path of a stone avalanche just to keep her breathing did something cataclysmic to Maeve's soul. The protective warmth that had been quietly growing inside her transformed into a volatile, primeval fury that scorched the freezing mountain air. With an immense, controlled physical grace, she gently shifted Arthur's injured frame into the deepest recess of the stone pit, ensuring he was entirely sheltered from any further debris. She did not reach for her empty Winchester. Instead, her hand descended to the interior lining of her heavy leather riding boot, her calloused fingers wrapping around the cold checkered walnut grip of a hidden, short-barreled Remington revolver, a lethal secret she kept for the absolute darkest corners of the territory mud. She rose to her full monumental height from the dust, her broad shoulders squaring as she stepped out of the trench, her dark eyes dilated into twin pools of absolute unbending retribution. The remaining apex mercenaries, disoriented by the thunderous rockfall and believing their targets were crushed beneath the granite, were carelessly scrambling over the scree with lowered rifles. They never saw the avenging angel coming. Maeve did not roar, and she did not warn them. She advanced through the frozen mist with the silent, terrifying momentum of an incoming blizzard. She raised the short-barreled iron weapon and fired at point-blank range. The first heavy lead slug struck the mercenary captain squarely in the chest, the kinetic impact throwing his body backward into a jagged snowbank. Before the remaining 3 gunmen could even swing their barrels, Maeve pumped 3 successive shots into the darkness with flawless, mechanical precision. One bullet shattered a rifle stock, a second tore through an outlaw's thigh, and the final round chipped the boulder right beside the last man's skull. Terrified by the sudden supernatural fury of the lone female cowboy, who seemed entirely immune to the cold and the chaos, the surviving mercenaries dropped their weapons into the slush, turned on their heels and fled down the mountain path in a frantic, screaming retreat. The silence of the high granite shelves returned, vast and unbroken beneath the glittering canopy of stars. Maeve did not pursue the cowards. She instantly dropped the smoking revolver and dove back into the trench, her heart hammering violently as she knelt beside Arthur. Her large, capable hands moved with a tender, therapeutic precision that completely contrasted her previous violence. She carefully sliced through his ruined wool coat, with her hunting knife bearing the dark, ugly bruising spreading across his slender shoulder. Arthur let out a soft, ragged gasp as she used a clean linen shroud from his satchel to tightly bind his arm against his chest, stabilizing the fractured bone. He opened his wide eyes, looking up at her through his cracked spectacles, his pale face reflecting an absolute, unbroken devotion. "The documents," Arthur whispered weakly, his fingers tightening around the waterproof pocket of his vest. "They didn't get them. Maeve, the rubbings are safe." Maeve felt a hot, rare tear slip down her sun-darkened cheek, her large hand gently cupping his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw with an immense, consuming affection. "You crazy city fool," she murmured, her low, gravelly baritone vibrating with a profound emotional density that sealed their sacred covenant forever. "You saved my life. You proved your spirit is grander than any mountain in this territory. The truth is safe, and so are you. Let's ride back and tear down their empire." The town square of Oakhaven was a cauldron of suffocating, tense anxiety under the heavy, overcast afternoon sky. A large crowd of local merchants, homesteaders, and helpless townspeople had gathered near the steps of the Federal Land Registry, their faces locked in expressions of grim apprehension. Standing at the top of the timber stairs was Director Henderson, the ruthless, impeccably dressed executive of the Apex Mining Corporation, flanked by a corrupt territorial magistrate and 4 heavily armed corporate guards. Henderson held a thick parchment document adorned with an official, blood-red judicial seal, a fraudulent eviction order designed to permanently seize Maeve's Fertile Valley pastures and strip her line riders of their livelihood. By order of the territorial governor and the statutory decree of 1862, these lands are hereby declared public mining property. Henderson's arrogant voice echoed across the quiet square, dripping with a cold corporate malice. He gestured to the armed guards, who began to chamber rounds into their rifles, preparing to ride out and forcibly remove Maeve's men from the basin. Any resistance from the Ironwood workforce will be treated as an act of armed rebellion against the state. The helpless townspeople murmured in fear, completely intimidated by the legal and financial weight of the syndicate. The heavy, unhurried clatter of iron horseshoes against the frozen gravel suddenly cut through the murmurs, drawing every eye toward the northern entrance of the town square. Through the parting winter mist emerged Maeve's massive buckskin stallion, its coat caked in mountain mud and glittering ice. Maeve rode with her broad shoulders squared proudly beneath her ruined leather duster, her chiseled features hardened into an unyielding mask of absolute defiance. But it was the man riding directly beside her that caused a collective gasp to ripple through the crowd. Arthur sat atop his mountain mare, his thin frame visibly exhausted, his right arm bound tightly against his chest in a blood-stained linen shroud from his painful collarbone fracture. His round, wire-rimmed spectacles were severely cracked, and his face was pale from the agonizing physical toll of the journey, but his wide eyes burned with a fierce, triumphant intellectual fire that instantly drained the arrogance from Henderson's expression. In his left hand, clamped against his chest like a sovereign shield, he held the waterproof leather satchel containing the definitive truth of the sovereign anvil meridian. Maeve pulled her stallion to a halt directly at the base of the registry steps, her towering presence completely blocking the corporate guards from advancing. She didn't draw a gun. Instead, she cast a deeply affectionate, protective glance toward the fragile gentleman beside her, stepping back to let his mind deliver the final devastating blow. Arthur straightened his spine, his articulate, refined voice ringing out across the square with an absolute ironclad certainty that shattered the corporate illusion before the entire valley. The heavy timber doors of the Federal Land Registry office slammed shut against the biting winter wind, trapping the massive, anxious crowd inside a room thick with the scent of old parchment, ink, and sweat. The townspeople packed the gallery from wall to wall, their breathless murmurs bouncing off the high cedar rafters as Arthur stepped up to the grand mahogany counter. Director Henderson stood directly across from him, his face twisted into a patronizing, arrogant sneer as he adjusted his silk necktie, completely confident that his corporate legal team had crafted an airtight deception. "You are wasting the magistrate's time, young man," Henderson scoffed, his voice dripping with a calculated, dismissive venom as he gestured to the red-sealed eviction decree. A bruised city clerk with a fractured shoulder cannot simply walk into a federal office and challenge a signed statutory order. The apex maps are verified and the land belongs to the corporation. Arthur did not flinch, nor did his refined composure fracture under the heavy weight of Henderson's corporate intimidation. Despite the blinding pain radiating from his broken collarbone with every breath, he used his left hand to deliberately unroll his charcoal tracing rubbings across the counter, pinning the edges down with his heavy brass surveying instruments. "The apex maps are not verified, Director Henderson. They are a clinical criminal forgery," Arthur declared, his articulate voice ringing out through the crowded hall with a sudden, thunderous clarity that instantly silenced the room. He pointed his slender finger at the dark carbon textures of the federal insignia he had risked his life to retrieve from the frozen northern shelves. "This is a certified rubbing of the original sovereign anvil meridian marker carved into the bedrock in 1862. Look at the unique 6-digit geological serial stamp stamped beneath the federal seal, Alpha 793. The corrupt magistrate leaned forward, his eyes widening in sudden, paralyzed shock as Arthur pulled the official Federal Archive registry from his leather satchel, laying it directly beside the rubbing. The 1862 Homestead Nullification Act explicitly states that any mining claim must be mathematically measured from the physical location of this specific stone, Arthur explained, his wide eyes flashing with a brilliant intellectual fire that completely captivated the legal authorities. Apex intentionally fabricated a false coordinate on their documents, placing the marker miles away on Maeve's grazing pastures to justify an illegal land grab. But as you can see by comparing the geological registry to this authentic stone stamp, the true meridian excludes her valley entirely. The document you hold in your hand, Director, is an absolute fraud. A massive, triumphant roar erupted from the townspeople in the gallery as the absolute truth of the conspiracy was laid bare before the entire valley. The registrar of the land office slammed his heavy gavel down onto the desk, his face locked in an expression of pure, unbending authority as he officially declared the Apex eviction decree completely null and void, ordering the immediate arrest of the corporate guards for document falsification. Henderson's face turned a pale, translucent white as his corporate empire collapsed into worthless shreds within a matter of minutes. Maeve watched from the back of the room, her broad shoulders squared proudly beneath her leather duster, her dark eyes overflowing with an intense, consuming devotion for the fragile scholar who had just single-handedly saved her kingdom. He had not fired a single shot in the town square, yet his magnificent mind had delivered the ultimate devastating victory, permanently proving that Trithuk was the most Vedite weapon on the wild frontier. The soft golden twilight of a peaceful winter evening settled over the grand valleys of Ironwood, casting a warm amber glow across the vast snow-covered fields. Inside the main timber fortress, the massive black cast-iron stove radiated a steady therapeutic heat that completely melted the remaining memories of the freezing northern ridges. The comforting aroma of fresh cedar smoke, roasted wild game, and hot chicory coffee hung thick in the air, creating an absolute sanctuary of hard-won victory. The long pine table, once covered in fraudulent corporate maps, was now laden with a heavy feast prepared to celebrate the preservation of the valley pastures. The atmosphere inside the great hall was one of deep, reverent quiet. The veteran Ironwood line riders and the local townspeople who had once looked upon the fragile city gentleman with dismissive prejudice now stood in absolute submission to his brilliant intellect. One by one, rugged cattlemen caked in trail dust approached Arthur's chair, quietly tilting their hats in profound respect, acknowledging that his academic mind had served as a grander shield than any 12-gauge shotgun on the frontier. Silas himself stepped forward, placing a polished brass compass on the table before Arthur, a silent, symbolic declaration that the scholar was now an honored brother of the wilderness. Arthur sat near the roaring hearth, his thin frame still exhausted, his right arm resting securely within its linen shroud to protect his fractured collarbone. His broken, wire-rimmed spectacles had been carefully cleaned, and though his face was pale from the agonizing physical toll of his sacrifice, a serene, unshakable peace rested within his wide eyes. He was no longer the outcast academic fleeing the judgment of his wealthy Boston family. He had found his true domain, his purpose, and an unyielding sanctuary among the stone foundations of the West. Maeve stood directly behind him, her monumental frame casting a protective, majestic shadow over his chair. She had cast aside her grease-stained leather duster, wearing a simple wool mantle that bared the formidable curve of her shoulders. Moving with an absolute unbending grace, she reached down, her large calloused hand gently resting upon his uninjured shoulder, her thick fingers squeezing his with an immense, consuming affection. When Arthur turned his head to look up at her, their eyes locked in a silent, sacred covenant, an unbreakable romantic bond forged in the freezing trenches and sealed forever by the warmth of the hearth. They were two opposites who had shattered an entire corporate syndicate, proving that when fierce physical power aligns with brilliant intellectual strategy, no force on earth can tear down their kingdom. True strength is never measured solely by the weight of a man's muscle or the speed of a woman's gun. It is found in the unyielding resilience of the spirit and the magnificent power of a mind determined to defend the ones they love. Thank you for watching this breathtaking and emotional premiere of the Ironwood anthology universe in episode 8 of the Cowboy Heartweaver. If your heart was deeply moved by Arthur's brilliant legal victory and Maeve's fierce protective devotion, please slam that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below with your thoughts on this incredible new couple. Turn on the notification bell so you will be the absolute first to experience episode 9, where a silent, towering blacksmith and a proud, progressive schoolmistress spark a brand new fire beneath the high granite shelves of Ironwood. This channel utilizes curated online resources and AI tools to create content for entertainment and educational purposes. Our content is created with respect and does not intend to promote hate or violate any community standards.